Catalonia, the part of Spain most famous for bitching about being a part of Spain. They're having a referendum these days, and it seems that they're about to become an independent country, although Spain won't allow it. So, Mr. Trim, what we're going to talk about today is, will they get their independence, and what will that mean for Europe?
I would turn the question a bit around and say, what is an independent country? An independent country is recognized as an independent country by other independent countries. And I cannot imagine other European countries except Catalonia as an independent country apart from Spain in the current political environment of Europe in 2017.
If the international community agrees that Catalonia should not be independent, then there's no problem. Then Spain can just crush the movement. But if the international community agrees that Catalonia should be independent, then there's also no problem, because then Spain can't really do much against everyone else. The problem is, if the international community disagrees with itself, then how will this election affect the rest of the world, and especially Europe? As I think most countries outside of Europe would probably accept this as an internal European matter.
I would disagree on every aspect of your argument, the Thoughtspin.
This is going to be interesting.
Let's see if I can remember all your points. If the European countries accept Catalonian independence, then I think the rest of the world would do the same thing. I would be very surprised that, for instance, China is going to block Catalonian membership of the UN, for instance. We have a bad case if the European countries as a bloc disagree internally on Catalonian independence, and then you have other huge countries like the US or China agreeing upon, well, we think Catalonian independence is a great idea, or for instance, Russia thinks it's a great idea. And Thoughtspin, you used the word crushing as a possibility the Spanish government would use against the Catalonian movement. In a Spanish context, crushing a movement means crushing the people behind the movement, or trying to remove the culture behind the movement. That was what Franco was trying to do after the Second World War against the Catalonian movement. And that is one of the main reasons that the movement still exists to this day. The international community wouldn't accept that the Spanish government trying to do the exact same thing as Franco did, in case that either we have a yes or no on the referendum on Sunday. They wouldn't accept that. So the Spanish government don't have free hands against the Catalonian independence movement.
I agree that the Spanish government cannot do as it did in the days of Franco. It cannot just mass slaughter the population. The European community, or the Western community at least, wouldn't accept that kind of approach within Europe's borders. But what Spain can do is to make, as they have threatened to do, make mass arrestation of mayors in Catalonia and political figures because they consider this vote illegal. And the only way Catalonia could respond in case it is declared illegal, if they still want their independence, is to take it by armed force. And if Catalonia starts using armed force, Spain will retaliate. So I think we are actually having a risk of an actual civil war in Europe appearing. And I also think that depending on how the rest of Europe looks at this, if the rest of Europe is divided, then that civil war might actually spread into many other parts of Europe. Or at least the fallout of refugees from Catalonia and Spain in case of a civil war will certainly affect the rest of Europe, and the economic disruptions following a war on the Iberian Peninsula.
I agree that the civil war on the Iberian Peninsula is a possibility, but I think the kind of civil war we would see on the Iberian Peninsula would be like the troubles in Northern Ireland, a decade-long low-scale civil war, and not a civil war like the one we are seeing in Syria right now. And I don't think they're going to be widespreading all over Europe like with the local civil wars all over Europe, for instance in Poland or in in France or in Britain. I think Europe would be divided like Europe was divided under the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s. So, Thoughtspin, what do you think would be the most probable political outcome of a no on Sunday?
I think it depends a bit on. First of all, I don't think it will be a no, because I think a lot of the people who would vote no simply won't participate in the election because they consider it illegal. But if it became a no, then it would depend. If it was really a resounding no, a big no, then the independence movement is dead, at least for a few decades more. But if it's on the verge, like a 50-50 vote, there's a risk that they will vote again in a year or two and we will see the same situation.
Yeah, especially in this case, because the Spanish government don't play with open cards. When the arrested members of the government of Catalonia, it came as a complete surprise for the international community. The Spanish government had not in any way declared that they were ready to take a step like that. So for argument's sake, if we get a yes on this referendum, what would be the consequences in the European context?
I think it will play into the rise of nationalism we're seeing in Europe. And the interesting thing is that the rise of nationalism doesn't really have anything to do with Catalonia per se, because it's mostly a reaction to the EU and to the migration crisis. But I think that it's so ingrained in the nationalist ideology that a people has a right to decide for their own country and define their own national country. So I think if it becomes a yes in the Catalonian independence vote, it will move into that context of the rising nationalism in Europe. And there's this sort of simmering, boiling conflict rising between nationalists and, in the lack of better words, let's call them federalists. Because these are probably the two biggest ideological and political blocs rising in all the countries of Europe at the moment, with the nationalists arguing for more restraint on the European Union, arguing for less immigration, and part of the ideology is also that countries should be able to decide for themselves, and that's also why they want the Catalonian people to define their own nation state, their own nationality. The federalists, on the other hand, focus more on either their pro-EU institutions or the right of the individual. So they tend to favor either the same current level of EU integration or more EU integration. Their view on migrants is more on the rights of the refugees than on protection of the countries. And I don't really know where the federalists will be in regards to the Catalonian independence referendum. But what is your assessment of the situation in regards to EU? Do you think the EU will support Catalonia or go against it?
I think the EU would be fence-sitting. They would take a good look on the result of the referendum, either yes or no, and take their stand from there. On the other hand, I think the reason that we have this situation right now is because of the EU. Not that the EU is responsible of the case, but right now we have not a federation, European federation, but close. We're not, and the situation is that Catalonia can actually become a member of this federation in par with Spain, and it would be on the grounds of the rules of the EU. It means that Spain cannot go into Catalonia, invade it, and then say you are now a part of me, like a brutal force in the Middle Ages. Which means that actually the EU could be a supporting ground for Catalonian independence, because they shouldn't be afraid of Spain invading them.
So what you're saying is that the EU offers a sort of protective framework that prevents Spain from using military retaliation against Catalonia, and therefore actually enables Catalonia to even have this referendum.
Exactly.
Thank you for listening to the Trimming Thoughts podcast with Thoughtspin and Mr. Trim. There's one final problem rising from this. The current national sport of Catalonia is to bitch about Spain. So if they gain their independence, what will they bitch about in the future? Catalonia?